Alrighty. Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Pamela, if we can put up our slides, I will get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Hilliard, and I am the Government Affairs Director with the Climate Center.
And good morning, everyone. Bonnie Benuel. I'm the Drawdown Director here at the Climate Center.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. We are going to talk about maintaining climate integrity in California's Cap and Invest program today. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsors who help make our webinars possible here at the Climate Center. So a huge shout out to the four listed here. And then next slide, please. I also want to give a shout out to all of our promotional partners who help promote these webinars so that everyone who's here today gets this on their radar and we are able to get as large of an audience as possible. So thank you to our promotional partners. Next slide, please. So today's webinar, here's the agenda. I'm going to give a high-level overview of who we are at the Climate Center, and then we will hear from Shauna from the Communities for a Better Environment. We'll also hear from Chloe, who is with Next Gen Policy. We'll hear from Danny, who's with University of Pennsylvania, and Paul with Pacific Forest Trust. And then we'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll end with a little wrap and then our take action. Next slide, please. So, who's the Climate Center? So, since 2001, the Climate Center has been a leader in making climate solutions a reality in California at speed and scale. We are a think tank, do tank, working to turn bold ideas into climate action for a climate safe future for all. We believe in a thriving, healthy communities. We envision a future where everyone has access to clean air and water, affordable and reliable energy, healthy food, thriving nature, and so much more. Next slide, please. So the Climate Center is laser focused on equitably reducing climate pollution at speed and scale, like I mentioned earlier, but focusing here in California. Our work catalyzes our states and nations to act for climate safe future. We think very much so as California goes, so goes the world. We have four pillars here at the Climate Center that we focus on, which are listed on this slide: phasing out polluting fuels, scaling up carbon drawdown, building resilient clean energy for all, and funding climate action now. Together with local governments, labor unions, business leaders, environmental organizations, climate justice advocates, and so many more, we push lawmakers in Sacramento to enact and accelerate equitable climate policies as soon as possible. I'll now pass it over to Bonnie to level set us on the topic for our webinar today.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison, and welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Now, before we turn it over to our esteemed panel, I just want to spend a few minutes going over the basics of CAP and Invest because a lot has changed over this past year, and it'll be easier to follow today's detailed conversation if we're all starting from the same baseline. So, Cap and Invest, formerly known as Cap and Trade, has been one of California's core climate tools since 2013. It has been and will continue to be instrumental in achieving our statewide greenhouse gas reduction targets, which are outlined here on the slide. Next slide, please. So, a quick overview of how Cap and Invest works. CARB, or the California Air Resources Board, sets a statewide cap on greenhouse gas emissions from the state's largest polluters. That includes folks like refineries, manufacturing facilities, and oil and gas suppliers. To drive down emissions, that cap shrinks every year. CARB issues allowances, with each allowance representing 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Polluters then have a couple of different options. They can, 1, reduce their own emissions, 2, purchase allowances, or 3, use a limited number of compliance offsets. And because that number of allowances declines over time, the market is designed to create an economic incentive to reduce emissions. Next slide, please. Allowances are then sold in quarterly auctions every year, and this is where the invest part of the program comes in. The money that's generated from the state, the sale of these allowances, goes primarily to 2 programs highlighted in the different shades of blue in the pie chart here. One is the climate credit, which is given directly back to utility ratepayers in their bills a couple times a year. And 2 is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or the GGRF. The GGRF then funds most of our climate programs like wildfire resilience, transit, land conservation, affordable housing, clean air, etc. Some of these allowances are also given for free to industry, which is in the yellow in the pie chart. And that is to prevent leakage, which refers to the risk of businesses leaving the state of California and instead polluting in a different state. So that's a really high level overview of how the program works. But last year, the legislature made some changes to the program and the funding through two different bills, AB 1207 and SB 840. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight a few of those major changes from those bills. First, AB 1207 extended the program all the way through 2045, explicitly tied the emissions cap to achieving California's 2030 and 2045 climate targets, and renamed it Cap and Invest. It was formerly known as Cap and Trade. Second, the bill tightened the rules around offsets. The cap on offset usage moved up from 4% to 6% of a company's compliance obligation. But for the first time, the offsets are now counted under the cap, meaning every offset used triggers the retirement of an equivalent allowance the following year. So offsets can no longer add emissions on top of the capped total. SB 840 overhauled how the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund dollars are allocated. Most notably, it established a new tiered priority system for spending. Second, this bill requires that CARB reevaluate the entire offsets program by the end of the year. And we'll get much more into that later in the presentations. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the 2026 rulemaking at CARB. In mid-January, CARB released its draft regulations, which tightened the cap by removing approximately 118 million allowances from the 2027 to 2030 budgets. CARB also began shifting allowances from natural gas utilities to electric utilities, and they floated a new but limited manufacturing decarbonization incentive, known as the MDI, to help manufacturers fund on-site decarbonization projects. But the January proposal was not the final package. After extensive stakeholder input, especially from the oil and gas industry, CARB released an updated proposal in April, which was then adopted by the board in May with a divided 9-4 vote. This included the doubling of the manufacturing decarbonization incentive from the initial $2 billion to $4 billion, which was funded by an additional 118 million allowances that CARB added above the cap. This represents a significant shift from funding going to community and climate programs to more industrial support. This major change will have significant impacts on not just the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, but also the climate integrity of the Cap and Invest program. The last thing I'll say here is that another initiative that CARB is working on right now is potentially linking our Cap and Invest program to that of Washington states, which could also impact the price of allowances. Next slide, please. Okay, now with all that being said, I want to turn over to our panel who will go into these changes and their impacts in much more depth. First, I'll invite Shauna Lazarow to turn on her camera and join us. She'll be talking more about the Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive. Shauna is the legal co-director at Communities for a Better Environment, where she works to combine community organizing, research, policy, and legal advocacy to empower low-income communities of color around environmental justice, including energy and climate justice. Shauna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. And could we get my first slide up, please? Thank you. Thanks so much to the Climate Center for inviting me and for inviting Communities for a Better Environment to present on this important topic. CBE is an environmental justice organization with a fairly unique triad model with lawyers and research scientists on staff in support of our staff community organizers who organize in LA and Bay Area communities. These are low-income communities of color where we organize, and these are the communities that host the state's highest concentrations of major polluters. So, because these major polluters are also the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, CBE has a long history with cap and trade, now called cap and invest. So reducing emissions where we organize is a matter of life and death for us, and also, as we are increasingly seeing, for you and for the planet. So the changes that Bonnie just described are extremely concerning. This morning, I am first going to go deeper into the Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive, or MDI. Then I'm going to talk through the lawsuit that we, CBE, brought challenging the rulemaking. Next slide, please. So what is the MDI? It is the first of its kind compliance mechanism that gives free allowances to manufacturers and to refiners to subsidize the use and or capital costs for this list. And next slide. CARB created essentially a new bank account that it is calling the Build Up California Reserve to fund these subsidies to refiners and manufacturers. And CARB printed new money. It minted 118.3 million new allowances to stock that reserve. And as Bonnie said, the value of those allowances, and this is CARB's estimation, they're valued at $4 billion of subsidies for the polluters who are eligible. So next slide, please. It sounds simple, but it's about 40 pages of coded regulatory speak. And as Bonnie said, CARB proposed a version of the concept of MDI in January of 2026. That is the version that CARB included in its draft environmental review of its regulation. That is called a Draft Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA. Remember that acronym. We'll come back to it later and throughout. In April, CARB put out this document that you see. Yes, it looks extremely complex. And this is what the CARB board approved in May, along with the final EIA. Next slide, please. But despite all those red lines and the cross references to NAICS codes, the document that was adopted is too simple. It lacks some very key elements. What it does is says that CARB will issue allowances if an applicant claims that it is going to reduce emissions. So the regulation lacks a standard methodology to evaluate claims that emissions will be reduced. It lacks a requirement to check the accuracy of the claims, and it lacks a process to dispute a polluter's asserted reductions. So also, polluters can get MDI allowances to pay for capital costs for whatever technologies they claim are going to reduce their emissions. The regulations don't require that these be best available control technology, or even that the polluter show that they reduced emissions at all. In fact, because the polluter will have to report how the allowances were used within a year from the issuance of the allowances, the capital projects may never even be installed. If that seems confusing, the CARB board was confused too. They deliberated for 8 hours, and they still didn't have clarity, although they did adopt the regulation. But because there were so many unanswered questions, the board required their staff to hold another workshop before it issues any MDI allowances. Next slide. Some things are clear, though. And if this is your first time talking about cap and invest or cap and trade, I want to just say the cap does not look like a hat. The cap is a line coming down. And so underneath the line is below the cap, and that is the pollution that is being emitted. Above the line is not pollution, clear skies. And this chart shows the status quo with the darker line, and then the green line shows what is the descending cap with the new changes. You see the jog where 118 million allowances are removed, and the orange or red bubble above is the MDI allowances, which are referred to as being above the cap. Next slide, please. I do a much better job thinking in terms of food. So here's the pie chart version of that. The larger on the left pie, and these are not good pies, these are not pies we want to have to eat, are the status quo pie. The January proposal is the pie that shrinks with the removal of 118 million allowances. The final staff proposal is the same shrunken pie but with a side of MDI allowances. So if we think in terms of food, if I'm on a low carbon diet, a low carb diet, this would be like taking some spaghetti off my plate, but then having a side of penne. It's not a low carbon diet, it's just two separate plates of carbs. Next slide, please. This has real health impacts for the communities where CBE organizes. Chloe is going to explain the invest part of the program this slide shows with the legislature's new prioritization tiers. I want to highlight that the cap and invest or cap and trade program took away the power to regulate greenhouse gas emissions directly at major sources in our communities. The thing we were given instead are these pollution reduction programs. And the April changes are set to take them away and instead give this money to the state's major polluters. Next slide. There are various steps being taken. I wanted to share this slide as information. There's potential legislative fix going through. Next slide, please. And these are some of the sources. Most academics looking at it confirm. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the legal challenge. So I mentioned our triad. We work with agencies that are going through rulemakings like CARB's regulation to do our absolute best to support the agency in complying with all the applicable governing laws during a rulemaking process. Those laws include the California Environmental Quality Act. But when is here, the agency approves a regulation without complying with applicable laws, we have a very short 30-day timeline to bring a CEQA lawsuit after the final EIA is adopted. Next slide. So that's what we did. This is the cover page of our lawsuit. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, the draft EIA came out with the January proposal before the MDI moved above the cap, grew to 118 million allowances, and changed to pay polluters now for blueprints that might reduce emissions at some point in the future. CEQA requires a full description of the project, or in this case, regulation, and an analysis of its impacts. The EIA did not describe the April changes or the impacts from those changes. The air quality and greenhouse gas impacts are foreseeably extensive, as are many other impacts, but I'm going to use air quality and GHG impacts as an example. So the facilities that qualify for the MDI, which are major manufacturers and refiners, they're already operating under cap and trade, and they have to purchase some allowances at auction. But the EIA did not describe or analyze the impact of providing free allowances so that these facilities can pollute without paying. Given that the entire belief undergirding the market-based system is that paying for the right to pollute disincents pollution, CEQA requires a description of projected emission changes when allowances become free. CEQA also requires that the impacts that are described and identified be mitigated, and the EIA doesn't mitigate these extensive impacts. Of course, emission reductions are the most logical mitigation, but there are other mitigation measures CARB could have adopted. Um, Having failed to accurately describe the impacts, CARB didn't mitigate those impacts. And unsurprisingly, CARB didn't respond adequately to the comments that a lot of people raised during the course of the administrative process, especially regarding the changed MDI, because there was an incredibly tight turnaround between the massive changes to the rule and the rule adoption. And lastly, when an agency makes significant changes to a project, CEQA requires the environmental document be recirculated for public review. CARB didn't recirculate the environmental analysis after April, and the board and staff had an extensive discussion about recirculation, during which staff acknowledged that they didn't want to recirculate because they wanted the vote in May. But that kind of urgency doesn't cure an inadequate EIA. The public and the board need a chance to understand what is going on. Next slide, please. So what do we want from our lawsuit? Injunctive relief, vacature, and we want the court to require a return to writ. And next slide, please. I will note that, and you probably noticed that this is just a CEQA lawsuit at this point. That is because the rule itself that we're discussing is not final yet. The Office of Administrative Law has to complete its review and give a thumbs up before it can go into effect. Sometimes OAL requires extensive changes before approving a CARB rule. That review is supposed to be completed by August 25th. So stay tuned, and thank you again for having me. I will pass it back to Allison.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Next, we'll invite Chloe Ames to talk about the impact the recent regulations will have on the climate integrity of the program and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Chloe is a climate policy advisor at NextGen Policy, where she focuses on climate and clean energy policies with an emphasis on the implementation of the Cap and Invest program. Welcome, Chloe.
Hi, all. My name is Chloe Ames, and as Allison mentioned, I'm a policy advisor with NextGen California. We are a California-based nonprofit dedicated to supporting and advocating for progressive policy, legislative, and programmatic changes in California. Thanks so much to the Climate Center for hosting us all today. Today, I'm going to talk, as Allison mentioned, a little bit about some of the environmental and affordability impacts of the latest Cap and Invest regulation. So to get us started, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the program background and add a little bit to what Bonnie shared earlier. So as Bonnie mentioned, last year, we just reauthorized the program through two pieces of legislation, AB 1207 and SB 840, to strengthen the Cap and Invest program through 2045. This then kicked off a rulemaking from the California Air Resources Board to implement the changes in that legislation and update the program, which was just passed this past May. There are two key functions of the Cap and Invest program. First, per the name, to cap our greenhouse gas emissions to reduce carbon pollution, and two, invest revenue raised by charging the state's biggest polluters for emitting carbon pollution. So for a little bit more background, I just wanted to share about how does it work? How do we actually reduce pollution within the program? So as I mentioned, the primary objective or function of the Cap and Invest program is to set this firm and declining limit on our emissions. Entities covered under the program represent about 75% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions and include refiners, electricity generators and importers, and manufacturing facilities. Facilities have three primary ways in which they can comply with the program. The first is simply reduce your emissions on site. Second, buy allowances at auction. Or third, purchase offsets. However, it's important to note that over 60% of the program allowances are allocated for free to utilities and industries. The yellow portion of this image on our right indicates utility allocations, which are all passed through to consumers as in the form of the California Climate Credit or direct rebates on our utility bills. That dark blue section are free allowances to industry to prevent leakage, as Bonnie mentioned, or industries leaving our state due to overregulation. However, it's important to note that the industrial allocations do not have to be passed through to consumers in any form of a credit. So now this brings us to the invest portion of our program. Since the program's inception in 2013, over $33 billion have been generated from the program to invest in a variety of climate-related purposes, including high-speed rail, wildfire prevention, mitigation, renewable energy projects, and a number of other programs in communities up and down our state, which I will talk about a little bit later. These funds also were required to benefit priority populations, with over 35% of that funding dedicated to priority populations. There's also the climate credit, which is another big affordability benefit of the program and has generated about $16 to $17 billion since 2014. However, it's important to note that the recent Cap and Invest program auctions have generated hundreds of millions of dollars less in prior years. Weak auction results are a signal that the program needs to be strengthened to tighten the number of pollution allowances. Simply put, there's been more supply than demand. So now this brings us to the latest regulation from the California Air Resources Board and how that impacts our environmental integrity. I really want to emphasize for this part of the discussion that the core function of the Cap and Invest program is to serve as a backstop to reach our 2030 and 2045 climate goals as established in AB 32 by setting this firm and declining cap on our emissions. As you can see from this image, that goal gets harder and harder to reach over time and as we get closer to our 2045 net zero goals, making the Cap and Invest program and specifically a binding cap even more important. However, as Shauna described when discussing the MDI, CARB's recent regulation undermines that core function. The newly established Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive, as has been mentioned, introduces 118 million allowances above the emissions cap. For reference of what does this actually mean, the emissions equivalent is roughly the same as 30 medium-sized coal-fired power plants in a year, which is more than ExxonMobil's global Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions in 1 year. So looking at this figure, the blue line shows the former regulation, and the red line is the latest regulation, which you can see has a greater downward slope. Last October, CARB itself claims that 118 million allowances need to be taken off the market before 2030 to reach our state's goals due to overallocation of allowances in the program in previous years. While these allowances can't flood the market all at once, based on CARB's own estimates, the MDI allowances can be fully allocated if the program is completely utilized by around 2032 or 2033. This means that we would again be oversupplying the market, bringing that red line up closer to the blue line and making it harder to reach our 2030 climate targets. It's also important to note that these emission reductions under the MDI are not as effective or impactful as the equivalent emission reductions of having a strong cap. There are also very few guardrails or guarantees on what can qualify as investments to be able to access the Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive allowances. Simply put, the emission reductions possible from projects funded under the MDI don't equal real emission reductions under the cap. So, for example, to access allowances under the MDI, a company could invest in a technology like carbon capture and storage to qualify for free allowances, which may not be built for years down the line. Not only do we know that CCS is not as impactful at reducing emissions as just setting this hard limit on corporate pollution, but also these investments could not have an impact for years down the line. We know that emission reductions today are more impactful than emission reductions in the future. The goal of this program is to set that strict, enforceable, and time-bound emission reductions limit. The MDI undermines that goal. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the invest portion or some of the affordability impacts of this program. I know Shauna showed this image, but I just want to pull it back up to really emphasize who some of the main winners are here in CARB's latest regulation. This graph was presented at CARB's latest hearing to adopt the final staff proposal, or that pie chart on the right. The chart on the left shows the regulation before it was updated. As you can see, that light blue section is the allowances that are available at auction, which funds the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Not only does the pie to the right, the final staff proposal, significantly smaller and shrinks, but also the proportion of that pie that is available to fund the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is significantly smaller. However, the only piece of the pie that overall increases is free allowances to industry, or that dark blue section. Even though that final pie is smaller, industry still gains more free allowances, going from 106 to 137 designated free allowances in the final staff proposal. Not all of this is not even considering the Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive, which Shauna mentioned is this new pie, which allows industry to access even more allowances under the MDI. However, it's important to note that allowance allocations is not the only factor that plays into some of the affordability benefits of this program. There are a number of other of changes to the program and program design that impact overall affordability, in addition to changes to allocation. We've already discussed pretty thoroughly the Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive, which is projected to oversupply the market and lead to lower auction prices and a potentially undersubscribed market. I think Paul will speak a little bit more to offsets later, but as Bonnie mentioned earlier, we moved offsets under the cap, which also will change the stringency of the program. Daniel will also discuss how the California program is linking with Washington, which will expand the market and make it larger. All of these design changes impact the price of an allowance and therefore the affordability benefits of the program. Finally, I do really want to emphasize that it's a market. And as we all know, markets are subject to external pressures. Market participants are subject to many external factors that can influence their purchasing power, such as larger geopolitical shifts, economic shifts, and much more. All of this is to say that we can't determine exactly what the affordability impacts will be, but we can make some educated guesses based on these different factors. So, what happens? Based on CARB's own estimates, the Legislative Analyst's Office determines that we can expect to see a decrease in about $2 billion per year to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That's half of the fund, which would effectively defund a lot of community programs. SB 840, the legislation we mentioned that passed last year that created a tiered structure for how programs are funded under Cap and Invest, ranked community programs listed here in Tier 3. This means that many of the community programs outlined here are expected to be partially or entirely defunded by this new regulation. Other changes to the program that we discuss also impact this funding. So, what does that actually mean for our communities? I want to talk a little bit about some of the program benefits and just go through each of these programs here to talk about what they actually do and what the loss would mean for us. So first, we have the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, which is one of California's most important affordable housing programs that also funds projects to protect farmland from development. California is only building affordable housing at 1/5 of the rate needed to meet the scale of need. With over $3 billion implemented from the program, Investments have supported the creation of over 20,000 new affordable homes, which are estimated to benefit nearly 280,000 households statewide. These cuts would backtrack on the state's progress on building affordable housing, and development costs will increase as projects. Next, we have the Transit and Intercity Rail Program. Since 2015, this program has invested billions of dollars in critical upgrades and expansions for rail and bus systems across the state, which has resulted in an estimated reduction of over 50 billion vehicle miles traveled. Investments in these types of projects, unfortunately, would also be reduced without dedicated funding. Another transit project that is critical for our state includes the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. This program has helped provide operations funding to run services for free and reduced fare programs for people with disabilities, older adults, and children. This also supports the transition to zero-emission vehicles. Some programs funded under LCTOP include paratransit, BART Transit, and other programs that fund public transit and are currently facing fiscal cliffs and desperately in need of funding to provide critical transit operations. Without LCTOP and no alternative funding, BART and other transit providers have stated that they will significantly cut transit service. Unfortunately, there will also be cuts to our clean water programs. The Safe and Affordable Drinking Fund program is the primary resource for households in California without access to clean drinking water. Since the program inception, it has dispersed $1.4 billion to 987 failing and at-risk water systems. This includes providing clean water to 129 school districts with unsafe water. However, there are still over 1,000 water systems that remain that are failing or at risk that need additional funds. And last but not least, I want to highlight the Community Air Protection Program, which is the only program in our state dedicated to addressing sources of pollution in overburdened communities. It continues to be championed by environmental justice communities as critical to protect local community health. According to the American Lung Association, California leads the charts for cities with the worst air pollution. The Community Air Protection Program specifically monitors air quality in communities that CARB has determined have the worst air pollution in California. Without this program, we will not be able to monitor or evaluate air quality in communities with historically the dirtiest air in the country. So I know that all sounds pretty grim, but I also just want to talk about some broader affordability impacts from the program beyond just GGRF. I see my time is short here, but I'll just mention there are a couple studies from Greenline Insights that specifically have noted that the MDI will impact cost savings for low-income households earning less than $100,000 each year. And then additional studies as well from UCSB that have concluded that the California Climate Credit will also be directly impacted by this latest regulation, specifically the MDI, and is expected to be significantly reduced. So I know this all sounds grim, but I do still have hope that there are opportunities for us to be able to strengthen the program moving forward. As Shauna mentioned, there is legislation as well as litigation efforts to attempt to make this program stronger and ensure that we can reach the environmental and affordability benefits that this program can provide. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chloe. It's really devastating to hear that so many important programs are at risk of not being funded or having their funding extremely reduced. We will have an action at the end of this webinar that we'll share that so you can send a message to your representatives asking them to protect this critical funding. But for now, I want to turn it over to Dr. Danny Cullenword. Before I do that, I just also want to give a quick reminder to folks to put your questions in the Q&A feature. We'll have a good chunk of time after everyone's presentations to go through those. So while Danny starts to share his slides, tell you a little bit about him. Danny will be talking about CARB's the changes in CARB's rulemaking and the potential linkage to Washington's Cap and Invest program. Danny is an economist and lawyer focused on the scientific integrity of climate policy and has co-authored a book about the political economy of carbon markets called Making Climate Policy Work. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks a lot, Bonnie, and thank you everybody for having me. Let me briefly begin with a short disclosure. In addition to being a researcher, I'm also a member of the program's official oversight committee, but I'm only speaking in my personal capacity today and not on behalf of the oversight committee. So I want to start by giving some context, both about the market link that's being discussed between California and Washington, and also because I think it helps illuminate the history of some of the problems that have led to the crisis we're now in with respect to this program's future. And we have two very different markets. We have California, which was first to implement a program like this many years ago, and we have Washington State, which recently adopted a program that's quite different in some respects and learned from many of our prior mistakes. In California, we set a program that has lax caps, meaning very generous allowance budgets. The supply of pollution permits is greater than emissions, and it turns out that was the case every year for the program's first decade. It also allowed for the heavy use of very low quality offsets, which expanded the compliance options and further diluted the program's impact by reducing prices and sending revenues mostly outside the state to things that were not delivering real climate benefits. And the combination of these features led to a large bank of allowances. That's the term we use to describe the fact that because there were so many pollution permits made available, people started buying more than they needed, keeping prices low, and currently have them and are holding on to them, both entities who have compliance obligations under the program, as well as people who are investing in these assets like you do in financial markets. And the result is we've had a relatively low price program is very close to our minimum program price floor, a little bit above $30 per ton today. Washington State took a very different approach when it designed a similar market mechanism. Like many features of the program are quite similar to what we have in California, but unlike California, they included language in their legislation and they implemented a program that has a higher ambition program with caps that are more strictly aligned with the emissions profile of the facilities it covers. They also allow for the heavy use of what I'll characterize as very low quality offsets, but they didn't allow those offsets to expand market supplies. And both of those factors contributed to a program that is higher ambition, stricter, and more effective at reducing pollution. It also features higher market prices at around $55 a ton today. And to give you a sense of visually what I'm talking about when I talk about lax program caps and low ambition designs, this is a figure from the Congressional Research Service, which just plots the annual allowance budget in the dark gray figures and the reported emissions under the program in blue. And you can see from this snapshot that the caps, the supply of allowances entering the market every year, were significantly in excess of the emissions covered by the program. And on top of that, not shown in this chart, was a significant use of low quality offsets, which further expanded and freed up those allowances. Sometimes it's helpful to think about a cap and trade program as a game of musical chairs, the idea with the players being pollution. And if you remove the chairs, the pollution permits, one at a time every round, eventually you're going to force the pollution to go away. Well, imagine a game of musical chairs where you have way more chairs than players. And that effectively describes the approach that California took for more than a decade in its carbon market. The concern with a lax program like this is represented in the form of what's called allowance banking. It's shown in this chart here from the Legislative Analyst's Office. If you have slack or lax caps in the first period of a program, entities can acquire those extra pollution permits, save them up for future use, comply with the program's stricter targets in future years, but not actually reduce their emissions in line with the program requirements. And this is a very old debate. This is a debate we have been having since, frankly, the early 2010s. And it's striking if you look at the history of this program in relation to the most recent regulatory decisions, because this is actually the second time we reauthorized the program. We actually reauthorized it the first time in a policy debate that occurred over 2016 and 2017, where because of our slack caps and the limited legal authority to continue the program, eventually people stopped participating in the auctions and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund cratered temporarily. The legislature and the governor worked together to reauthorize the program, which included significant direction and mandatory direction to look at this problem of there being too many allowances in the program and doing something about it, which CARB studiously ignored and put out fake numbers indicating that there weren't a problem and have not since revisited the issue. Fast forward to the most recent legislative discussions in 2025 and the rulemaking that just occurred this year in 2026. Very similar set of issues where there continues to be direction to address the stringency of the program, which CARB has again studiously ignored. And in this case, I think done something more extreme, which is increased the allowance budgets relative to what they say is necessary to get to our targets. I want to show you some numbers, and I appreciate for people who aren't deep in the weeds, this is really abstract looking, but I'm just going to walk you through the logic that CARB presented in its rulemaking. This is a table that is presented in the January proposal from staff, the first official proposal implementing the direction that CARB ultimately selected. And they said, well, we have kind of three different levels of ambition. We can align with the minimum reductions for 2030 that are required by state statute. That's 40% reduction by 2030. we can align with the requirements in the current scoping plan from 2022, which calls for a reduction of 48% by 2030. And we can consider an even more ambitious reduction of 55%, which is allowed but not required. And they came up with calculations for the number of allowances they would need to pull out of the program to increase to that level of ambition, and some numbers around the cumulative totals of allowances that would achieve. Now, I want to pause. It's not entirely clear where these numbers come from, and we know for a fact that they don't include the problem of allowance banking. I told you that hundreds of millions of allowances have built up in private accounts due to the program being slack over its first decade. And that's not accounted for here. So we're not even going to address the elephant in the room. But I want to flag this because the history of what CARB did in this regulatory process is pretty striking. So when you begin a formal rulemaking process, you do something called a standardized regulatory impact assessment, or a SRIA. This is the cost benefit analysis. It's the sort of introductory thinking around the trade-offs and choices. That analysis was done on the basis of the 48% target that's discussed in that table. When CARB staff came up with their initial proposal in January about how they were going to implement the new statutory language, they downgraded and they said, well, instead, we're only going to aim for the lower emission target, or the less ambitious target of just 40%. And then in the revised proposal that came out in April and was approved by the board in May, they said, well, we're going to keep aiming for that, but we're also going to add all the allowances we take away into this new manufacturing decarbonization incentive. So setting aside the problem that, as I'll make the case to you, none of these numbers are actually grounded in any meaningful analysis or data that I can see or come up with. They're internally inconsistent, because even if you wanted to aim for the 40% target and you thought it was reasonable to take away 118 million allowances, that's what's required to get there, I have no idea how you can make the case that putting them back and making them available is at all consistent with the claim that you're complying with the minimum statutory reduction. Nevertheless, that is the approach that CARB took. So a couple of questions jump out to me. I'll just read them quickly and we can get into the audience questions as we go. So why didn't CARB address the question of allowance banking? There's specific mandatory statutory language that tells them to address it. I don't see them addressing it. Why not? Why wasn't the program aligned with the current scoping plan target? The scoping plan is going to be revised in the near future, and I would not be surprised to see it become less ambitious as to near-term objectives, given how little progress we've made in the state. Nevertheless, there's mandatory language in statute that requires alignment with the scoping plan target, and you can ask the question, why did that language not get addressed in the rulemaking? And finally, as I indicated in my previous slides, what does it mean to sort of consistently weaken while making the same sort of claims that everything's aligned and more or less consistent, while consistently weakening the actual analytical targets expressed in the rulemaking? I don't have answers to these questions, and in some sense they're rhetorical, because I think the real answer is it's politics rather than reason, but that is, those are questions you can ask. Finally, the last topic I want to touch on before handing off to my colleagues is we have the prospect of a potential market link between California and Washington. In many respects, this is potentially a positive thing. For your awareness, the way this works is when two similar markets want to link, they make their allowances and offsets cross-fungible, meaning that a California polluter can use a Washington allowance to comply with California rules and vice versa. And effectively, that causes the markets to price the two sets of instruments in very similar and sometimes identical ways. So we would expect the market prices in these programs to align somewhere in the middle. We can talk about where and how to think about that. My expectation, given the size of these two markets, is that it's not likely we're going to see Washington prices in California. It's more likely that Washington is going to see significantly lower prices if a link is consummated. And I have a lot of positive things to say about the design of the Washington program, which I think learned from many of the mistakes of the first decade in California. I think one important message to communicate is that it's not clear what a link means for Washington, because we have a lot of problems in our program that are essentially imported into theirs if a link is consummated. And I'll mention one of the strengths of the Washington program is their statutory framework does require them to mandatorily look and evaluate the ambition and the allowance budgets of any prospective linking partner. In theory, California has that, but it's a non-binding process in California law. It is a binding mandatory process in Washington. So the questions I asked about CARB's rulemaking are also questions that are both potentially politically and legally relevant in Washington state as well. Again, I don't have any negative thing to say about the link. I think the concept of the link is a perfectly sound thing. And the IEMAC, the advisory committee on which I've served, has previously recommended this link. So this is not a criticism of the link, But I think it's very important to be aware it doesn't solve our problems, and it's very unlikely to meaningfully affect the budget outlook that my colleague Chloe presented in the previous session. And with that, I will close, and I look forward to getting into conversation after the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. Our final speaker of the day is Paul Mason, who will talk about the Offsets Program. Paul is the Vice President of Policy and Incentives at the Pacific Forest Trust, where he has been advocating for policy changes that improve landscape resilience to wildfire and other climate stressors. Passing it over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Allison. So as Allison said, I'm Paul Mason with the Pacific Forest Trust. And whereas my colleagues have mostly talked about the regulation action that CARB took in this last year or more, I'm really going to focus in on what's going to be happening over the next few years and where we have some opportunities to potentially make some improvements in how the offset program works. Next slide. Sorry. So Pacific Forest Trust has been around since the early 1990s. We've had a long history working in the climate policy space and in natural resource policy more broadly. Our niche is really working on the private land side of things and trying to find ways to align state policy incentives with making it feasible for landowners to do better management than would otherwise happen if you're driven just by trying to create an economic return from your land, which is what most landowners are, or many landowners fundamentally need to do with their lands. Next slide. So there are many concerns with the existing offset program. Danny could have done this presentation for a good long time. He's been an outspoken observer, we'll say, about some of the challenges with the offset program. I just want to highlight a few of them here and how they've driven this need to do an assessment of the way the program is working. First, disturbances are increasing. As climate has become hotter, drier, the atmosphere is thirstier, fire behavior has increased, and we've really seen greater impacts from wildfire and from pest mortality in the forests of the West over the last decade. And that's having impacts on the assumptions that were built into the offset program buffer pools. There's long been criticisms and challenges with the fact that offsets are used here in California's program, and therefore California consumers and the people who are affected by the increasing costs driven by the program, because of course at the end of the day, the point of the cap and trade program is to put a price on carbon, and that is ripples out through the price of things. That's part of what the market signal does. So we would like to see the benefits that can flow from the offset program, meaning some of the community benefits and benefits to landowners, accrue here in California. But a majority of those benefits have gone outside of California. Under the regulation, at least half of the offsets are supposed to occur in California or with direct environmental benefits in California. But because of the way some of the offset protocols work, notably the ozone depleting substances protocol, a disproportionate amount of the offsets are actually occurring outside of California and not bringing the broader co-benefits that they could here to Californians. The one that really is my sort of, animating concern is that offsets fundamentally are just counting carbon. They're treating carbon as a commodity, and that is the thing that is traded in the cap and trade program. But when we start thinking about this in the context of, for example, forests, and the forest offset protocol is by far the largest source of offsets in the program, forests are more than just carbon. And when we're managing just for carbon and only valuing the carbon, we end up in creating a condition where we're not managing forest lands for climate resilience, for ecological health, and we're actually can be creating an impediment to managing that way. And lastly, the protocols have not really had a thorough update in more than a decade. And I would further observe that the fundamentals of the way that we approach the protocols, the offset program, and especially the forest protocols, they really predate any of our other regulatory climate policy. The first forest protocols were actually they predate AB 32, and they were sort of rolled into the regulatory program with some modifications, some of which did not necessarily make them more ecologically beneficial. But there hasn't really been a thorough reassessment of, is this the best way to be advancing our climate goals through an offset program since the early 2000s. Next slide. So one of the two bills that passed last year that reauthorized the cap and trade program was SB 840, and that both reorganized the greenhouse gas reduction fund allocations, which was talked about previously, and made kind of a hash of that whole budgeting process. But it also requires the Air Resources Board to study and report to the legislature on the offset program. And specifically by the end of this year, and they're going to miss this deadline, I'll come back to that in a minute, they're supposed to assess, how offsets are contributing to the state's climate goals. And it'll be important to make sure that it is broadly construed to be not just, greenhouse gas reduction, but our broader natural resource and wildfire goals. Possible changes to the programs to improve the direct environmental benefits that accrue in the state, how to make it more attractive to be doing projects in state. And then this final point that's required, that's where I'll spend more time talking in a moment, is how might we take an alternative approach to valuing in-state projects so that we get greater benefits for other state goals, specifically our nature-based climate targets, which were promulgated last year, and California's 30 by 30 conservation goals, which is seeking to conserve 30% of private lands and waters by 2030. So those were supposed to happen by the end of this year. The budget change proposal that would give CARB additional staffing to do that was always going to be an aggressive time frame. They actually haven't received the funding or staffing to do this yet. We would have expected that to have moved in June, but along with a number of other things, it was held to the end of the legislative session at the end of August to act on. So this will be at least a couple of months late. Frankly, I suspect that this process will spill over into early 2027. Presumably, based on some of what that demonstrates, we'll then update all of the compliance protocols, which, as I mentioned, haven't been updated in quite a while. And then there is a requirement in law to now revisit and update them every 5 years on an ongoing basis, which I think is a solid improvement. Next slide. So our idea, what the Pacific Forest Trust has been pushing, is to take a different approach to offsets. We can leave the existing protocol in place, but let's create a new system that would allow us to do offsets that were based on conservation easements that require management for climate and fire resilience, for ecological improvement, where we can embed in the terms of the easement that the landowner, I'll talk about forests here, is managing to create, more large old trees, more ecologically appropriate conditions, restoring the meadows and some of the things that you can require in an easement that you can't currently require in a protocol that is just counting carbon. So that way we can actually have the projects be focused on advancing the ecological goals as well as in ways that also increase carbon. So we would build that on that legal tool of working forest conservation easements that contain management terms, which we've been doing for decades in California. We have over 100,000 acres, just Pacific Forest Trust, of these sorts of easements in California. And those would be, again, secured by these easements that are legally durable. They're truly permanent. We'd then be able to quantify the increases in carbon that are actually legally secured rather than trying to count every ton of carbon on the property, and be able to enforce on those as we do with any conservation easement. And then one of the other benefits here is we get to build on the process that already exists for conservation. When you do a conservation easement, the land trust, whoever that may be, the legal requirement for a conservation easement is that it is monitored every year in perpetuity for compliance with that easement. So if we can build on that requirement that's already happening, I find that far more practical than the level of monitoring and verification and sort of excessive focus on counting every ton of carbon that we're currently doing in the existing protocol program. Next slide. So again, we would run this portion of the program somewhat differently, whereas offset protocols as they're done right now are developed by a landowner, largely looking at what's the greatest benefit for the landowner. Under this conservation-based program, the state would have a role in selecting where projects occur. It would be very much like how we do conservation right now, where land trusts and agencies are identifying good opportunities that advance ecological and climate resilience goals, as well as carbon sequestration goals, and then executing on those. It would be permanent, count towards 30 by 30. And in contrast to, the way the protocol works right now, all of these would be in California. So would we be generating benefits for, protecting our water supply, improving the fire resilience of our landscape, and protecting wildlife habitat and biodiversity. Next slide. So just to maybe run through in a little more detail how we would envision this working differently than the existing protocol, we would identify projects and establish an easement, execute those in the same way that we do a conservation transaction right now, working with the Wildlife Conservation Board. The state would then sell the offsets through a marketplace similar to the auction. So that would also be different in that the state would actually be making these credits available in a way that was easier for the compliance entities to access, as opposed to having to go out and find an individual broker of offsets. And then the revenue from selling those credits, from the state selling those credits, can be used to fund another cycle of acquisitions and creation of these easement credits, and just a self-perpetuating cycle. Next slide. So again, just a quick recap of sort of the ways that you would contrast with the existing program, and we're very much hoping that this will be a centerpiece of the report that CARB's working on for the end of this year, beginning of next year, is that in contrast to private actors selecting where they want to do the project, the state would have a role in identifying where to do a project for maximum benefit. They would all be in California. We would build on the monitoring that happens under existing conservation easement monitoring requirements. We would establish this revolving fund for conservation, as opposed to this being just as opposed to existing offsets being just a transaction between your compliance entity, like Chevron, for example, and a offset developer, where there's no role for the state. And rather than those traditional offsets, which are just focused on carbon, would be able to design them so that we're advancing broader state goals, which I frankly think are being under considered in climate policy right now, in terms of making sure we actually have a sustainable water supply and reasonable fire behavior on our landscapes. Next slide. So again, this is a bit of a recap of we have a better opportunity to advance our climate mitigation and adaptation, not just carbon, but also resilience, our biodiversity goals, and our water goals. And I think we have one more slide. Yes, by tweaking how we would run this part of the offsets program, would be able to focus our benefits in places where we can maintain healthy landscapes for water supply. This is a conservation easement that we did a decade or more ago up in Sierra Valley, north of Truckee. It was threatened by development, and in this case, we were able to keep it as a working ranch where it provides key water for the Feather River. And that has helped make that, this particular ranch, but this is true more broadly, helps to make the economics viable to maintain some of those rural economic practices that are a big part of California, but that get lost in the conversation sometimes. Next slide. Again, we would maintain the same legal standards as under the current offset requirements under law, and it would all be voluntary with landowners. Last slide. So we do expect public engagement on this offset report, and hopefully this new nature-based climate credit proposal that we're trying to advance. That has all moved more slowly than intended, but I would expect that by October of this year, they'll get involved in that in a more public way, spilling over into the first quarter of next year. And that'll be a good opportunity for all of us who are interested in how might we make the offset program more meaningful and offer greater benefits to California, a good opportunity to engage and make sure that's taken seriously. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Paul. We're now going to go into our Q&A portion of the webinar. So I invite all the panelists to come back on camera. And while they're doing that, I know that there's a whole world of Cap and Invest. There's a lot of jargon that's being used. Hopefully, this webinar is helping everyone understand the system a little bit more. One question that we got from the audience is to explain the difference between allowances and offsets. So, Paul, since you were just talking about offsets, can you please differentiate the two for the audience?
Sure. Allowances are sold by the state at an auction quarterly up to the amount that are under the cap. Offsets are offered as a private transaction where an offset project developer, like oftentimes a timber company, would develop these offsets and then sell those in the private marketplace. And a compliance entity, an oil company or somebody, can buy those typically at a lower price than allowances and can use those for up to 6% of their compliance obligation, the amount of credits they need to turn in quarterly to remain in compliance with the program. So it's a cheaper way for the compliance entities to meet their obligation up to a point.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for clarifying that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and direct a question towards Danny, but if others want to answer, they're more than welcome to too. So a couple different panelists, or this is for all the different panelists, but Danny, again, if you would like to start us off, what is your position on expanding the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, from electricity to fuels, cement, and other sectors? Would this solution be more effective than the MDI proposal?
That's a really interesting and good question. It may sound deep in the weeds to people who aren't sort of familiar with this work, but I think it really speaks to the core tensions we've all been talking about. So I want to remind people, Chloe showed a great slide about the pie charts where the sort of size of the pie is shrinking and the size of the slice going to industry is growing and actually increases substantially when you include this new manufacturing decarbonization incentive. And the stated rationale for giving free allowances to industry is addressing the concern around leakage, the idea that a competitiveness effect for a company that pays for its pollution in the state, they're going to be less competitive when out-of-state competitors who don't have those costs are competing with them. And that's a legitimate concern. What you see in a number of other programs, and I think Europe in particular is moving toward saying we need to start charging importers for their pollution, just like we charge our domestic companies. So that's what people call a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Two very quick points about this. If you move to that type of approach, you don't need to give away the allowances for free, and we can address the program funding issues that Chloe and others have raised. Second thing to point out is I think it's a mistake to talk about this as a carbon border adjustment. That's a term that wonks use about this. But we already have several precedents for how imports are addressed in California climate policies, including treatment in this program for the electricity sector, where we include imports, and in the low carbon fuel standard, where we do a comprehensive assessment of in-state and out-of-state emissions for any fuel that's sold in the state. That's a well-tested legal precedent for addressing those kinds of concerns and would allow CARB to produce a similar approach to some of the industrial sectors that are subject to leakage risks. And the reason that's important is because if you moved in that direction, you wouldn't have to give away so many allowances for free, and you'd have more allowances to fund the community programs that are getting gutted right now. Last point to make about this was mandated for CARB to look at in the 2017 extension bill, and they were mandated to produce a report by the end of 2025. So there were 8 years. I know sometimes we have staffing problems one year or the next, and I get that there's hiccups. 8 years to deliver that report. It's now 9 years. It's more than a year overdue, and I don't think it's an accident that CARB didn't look into this, because it's a direction, if one took seriously, that would allow us to sidestep some of these just awful choices that got made out of political expediency rushed at the last minute. So I can't say enough about the value of taking that conversation seriously and the shortcoming of not addressing that in a more robust conversation in the implementation process. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Does anyone else want to add on to that question about the carbon border adjustment mechanism?
I have a follow-up question to it for Danny. And hearing that CARB has not released that report, is there something that would be beneficial from the legislature to encourage them to do so, or engagement from our advocates who are on this call with CARB to encourage them to do that report?
I mean, there are so many examples of clear statutory direction to CARB that the agency simply just does not implement and ignores. And this is a situation where the legislature has made a mandatory requirement. And I think if people want to get serious about asking, and again, I just want to hearken this back to, like, the changes were made very quickly in April with 15 days for people to comment. This is no way to do a major policy conversation. And I am not suggesting that we do the exact same thing and think about some complicated new change in 5 or 10 days. That is why having 8 years to produce a report is a reasonable amount of time. And I think it's time to hold people accountable for the structural intention of not engaging with empirical research, with not engaging with deliberative processes. And at any point, the legislature can say, we've spoken very clearly about these issues in the past, and we want to do something about it going forward. There's already direction, though, and I encourage you, this is a political problem, not a problem of policymakers not paying enough attention. They paid attention. They're getting ignored. What to do about that is a political problem.
Thank you, Danny. Speaking about the role of the legislature, there are certain statutes that CARB does follow from the legislature. And since the legislature oversees CARB, one of the questions from the audience, and Chloe, I'll start off with you, and we can have others answer this as well. But, CARB board approved the staff rulemaking, but is there a role that the legislature can still play now to remedy some of the challenges that you highlighted in your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. As that question mentioned, the legislature does have discretion to guide California Air Resources Board. So I mentioned this in my presentation, but the way that this process works is it's a directive of the legislature. So the legislature passed those two pieces of legislation we've been discussing, AB 1207 and SB 840. Within those two pieces of legislation, they had some very clear goals and criteria that changed the program. One of which being that there had to be a firm cap on the program that aligned with our 2030 and 2045 goals. As we've discussed today, the MDI does undermine that, which is part of CARB's regulation. So we know that it's now CARB's role to then implement what the legislature outlines, but they do have a lot of discretion over how they do that, and that's why we're seeing some of the results we're seeing based on this latest regulation. So the legislature can always come back and say, here are additional guidelines that we have, and set those very strong guidelines for CARB. I will just add, in terms of the MDI, I know we've been talking so much about it. There wasn't any mention specifically. And so this new program was just entirely created by CARB. It wasn't that the legislature directed them to do that, but it was part of that discretion that I mentioned that CARB does have. Shauna had a slide on this, but there is a current bill that is being deliberated within the legislature. It's SB 1216 by Senator Laird, and it's what we call a budget trailer bill. So it's specifically related to the budget. It does aim to set some guardrails, specifically around the MDI, which again, I think we've discussed a lot about the implications of what that mechanism could do for both our climate progress and also some of the affordability benefits. So there is activity within the legislature. There is opportunity for them to engage. I can quickly outline SB 1216's guardrails around the MDI basically state that one, we have to ensure we reach our climate goals, our 2030 and 2045 climate goals. Two, that we must determine that the MDI actually has some affordability impact, specifically on gas prices. And three, that GGRF is fully funded before there can be allowances that are provided from the MDI, which includes the programs that I discussed today. So there's absolutely opportunity to summarize this, and we are looking for them as our representatives to take action.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I'll pass it over to you, Shauna. I see that your hand's raised.
Yes, thanks. And thanks, Chloe, for clarifying exactly what's actively going on right now. As the litigator on the screen, at least, I will say that the clearer the legislature can be about mandatory deadlines, not framing things as guidelines, but actually requirements under the legislation, the less space there is for CARB to disregard suggestions or guidances. And that is important. We're blessed to have a state legal system that does have this writ practice where state agencies have to follow the law and the courts will enforce that. And so I would ask all of you who are in the legislature to keep in mind that if you want to see CARB doing something, tell it it has to do that. That was my one, and agree with everything else that Chloe said.
Thanks, Shauna. I'm going to open this up to all the panelists to feel free to answer. The next question I have is some people are arguing that with an administration, a federal administration that's hostile to climate for California and Washington, that it would not be a good idea to reopen this rulemaking as it could expose the cap and invest program to more scrutiny and risk. How would you respond to that question? Go ahead, Shauna.
California is already in the sights. I don't actually know that reopening a rulemaking that just closed would increase that risk. And so I don't think that we can operate in an atmosphere of fear. I think that, in fact, now is the time when California needs to show and Washington needs to show that we are able and we intend to reduce our carbon impact despite the best efforts of the current administration.
Go ahead, Danny.
Maybe just to add, so first of all, I mean, I think it's a legitimate question, and I appreciate the motivation. It's something that I think is on everybody's minds. I want to offer two reflections. One is that I've been hearing that line since I started working on this program in the early 2010s. It's trotted out every time there's a bad decision. And that doesn't mean it isn't potentially valid here, but I just want to flag, like, every time some horrible deal gets baked, people say, we can't reopen it. It'll all get blown up. The feds will do something bad. And we live in a terrible world where that's a question you could be thinking about. But that I find that really an uncompelling way to think about the level of compromise that's been forced down our throats here. Second thing to say, and I don't mean any disrespect to the person who asked the question, because I think it's reasonable, it's important, we should talk about it, but it invokes a lot of the framing of abuse victims. And I'm sick of it. The idea that we can't make good decisions or can't pursue sound policy processes because we'll get hit if we do that it's really concerning to me. And I raise that with a lot of sensitivity about how those issues operate in the context of domestic violence and other situations. But it borrows a lot of those psychological framings. I think we need to be aware of that. Thanks.
Appreciate that candid response, Danny. Shauna, I have another question here for you around the MDI. Hopefully everyone knows that's a Manufacturing Decarbonization Incentive now. And this is a little bit of a long question. It provides some important context. So I'm going to read it. Just be a little patient here. So as it relates to manufacturing facilities, can the panelists speak towards how they envision decarbonization to take place? Certainly, there are some industries like refineries where we'll see widespread closures as the economy is decarbonized, but there are other manufacturing industries that play an important role in the economy. For example, food manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, building materials, etc. Where there is significant leakage risk in those industries, can you speak towards your vision of how California can decarbonize these facilities if the current cap and trade, cap and invest approach is changed as you're advocating, particularly keeping in mind that federal support for manufacturing decarbonization have evaporated?
Yeah, I very much appreciate this question because the workers who work in industry also often live in our communities. And we are extremely concerned about, keeping healthy, strong jobs and in our communities and in our state. But I guess I would turn the question around to a degree and say first, here's the one scenario that we're in. This is a time of extreme stress for California's most vulnerable communities. Um, should we be providing additional subsidies to California's biggest carbon polluters? Just looking at refiners, as Chloe showed the research from UC Santa Barbara, that refiners under the new MDI will be getting potentially more free allowances, significantly more free allowances than their emissions. And At the same time, our communities are not going to be getting the clean air that we need and the clean water that we need from the GGRF. And so looking specifically and so I guess to finish that thought, we know how to get emission reductions. We require best available control technology at the facility. And I guess my answer to that excellent question in the chat about industries that, we want to see and keep in California, we know how to do this. It's also a question of fairness, I think, to manufacturers, and it sets expectations very clearly. Rather than turning pollution reduction into an opaque and ever changing sort of investment game, and are the rules today going to be the rules tomorrow and different from yesterday? And will, some manufacturers did stash and bank their allowances, and we know how to do this. But full disclosure, I was one of the lawyers who was part of the initial challenge to the creation of the cap and trade system. And I made the same arguments that we actually know how to reduce pollution. We regulate directly.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Danny, I see that your hand's up. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Chloe.
I'll be very brief. So I think that it's a great question, and I actually think we do need to think about some funding support for some of the industries, particularly those that face decarbonization challenges. So I maybe have a slightly different point of view than Shauna does, although I think her points are well taken. The distinction I would draw is the current program that CARB has developed basically says if you file an application, we give you the money. That's it. Anybody gets it. You just file the application if you're in one of the qualified sectors. There's no discretion. There's no stringency. There's just money goes out the door. That's the exact wrong way to do this. And I do think that there are many important applications where we do need to be thinking about lost federal money and California's strategic priorities, but we ought to be having a balanced conversation about how to share the very limited budget resources that are available rather than categorically prioritizing one set of stakeholders and automatically giving a very broad group of stakeholders, including the oil and gas industry, free money when they file a submission. That's the wrong way to go about a very good conversation we need to have about how to support industrial decarbonization in the state, in my view. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny. Over to you, Chloe.
Yeah, I agree. obviously, a path to net zero and decarbonization is extremely challenging, and there isn't one right answer. But I do just want to emphasize, I think, Bonnie, you mentioned this at the opening of this conversation, that the point of the Cap and Invest program is to decarbonize in the most cost-effective way possible by making it a market. And so, not to say that we shouldn't be incentivizing decarbonization, but that's not the goal of this program. The goal of this program is to decarbonize cost effectively. And as we discussed today, the MDI specifically undermines that core goal, right, of setting a firm cap. And so this is all not to say that there shouldn't be decarbonization incentives, and we need to think creatively as a state and also, different agencies within our state. But putting that into this program does undermine that core function of our program, which is to set a cap and do so in a way that provides the most cost-effective, pathway to decarbonization.
Thanks, Chloe. I have one final question, and it's something that I've noticed we've talked about a couple times today, is that politics is different than policy making. And I'm curious if you could talk more, either Chloe or anyone on this call, to talk more about some of the political dynamics that led to the current rulemaking and what tactics are being undertaken to build power to address them.
Small
Anybody?
questions. I see Paula muted, so I'm happy to jump on it after. Where?
I'm sorry, did I
Okay.
get called out?
Oh, I thought you unmuted and wanted to answer. I'm
Oh, no,
happy to jump
I'm sorry. I
in.
was already unmuted. I mean, I think
My
that just to start, I'll leave it to you to figure out like how do we solve this problem.
Mhm.
But the broader politics around affordability are obvious everywhere in politics right now. We're seeing it in the legislature on practically everything, and it's like a broad deregulation push. Like every time you turn around, it seems like there's a new CEQA exemption or another type of, let's soften the requirements. And I think it was inevitable that we hit a friction point at a certain point. I mean, the fundamental goal of the cap and trade program is to make carbon more expensive. And that's going to send signals through the economy at the gas pump and electricity and other places. It's going to make things more expensive. And in a political environment where there's an enormous sensitivity to making things more expensive, I think that there was a lot of political support for just saying, hey, can we just slow this down, take some of the bite out of it, in a way that I don't have to actually stand up and, say that directly, but just kind of make this go away a little bit. And I think that that's kind of the political context that led CARB to come up with the MDI, fix there. I mean, I think the shift in how do we address the what feels like just a running away from all of our sort of public interest laws, frankly, that we're seeing every day here in Sacramento. That's a question I'm going to leave to Chloe in the
Okay, and
biggest cop out of the day.
just want to acknowledge we have 2 minutes yet left. So if we can do speed round answers, that would be great. Passing you to Chloe.
Great. Yes, agreed. Affordability is the name of the game. We've talked about this, already today. Obviously, it can't be detached from what's happening federally. I do want to mention that the war in Iran also played a piece in this conversation, specifically around affordability. We know that gas companies, specifically oil companies, were receiving windfall profits from the war, and they used those profits to also advocate and push for this legislation. And so that's not to be detached from this, conversation and why we landed with the regulation that we did. That they have a lot of lobbying power in Sacramento. They always have, but especially now they have an extra paycheck. And so to, think that they need further subsidies is challenging to match. So I could say a lot more, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chloe. Go ahead, Danny.
I'll add very briefly, I think, Paul, that's exactly the right place to start the diagnosis. And the problem that I see time and time again, and this happened in the last reauthorization, is certain industry voices never let a crisis go to waste. You would not hear me using this kind of language about criticizing the program for what just happened if people had said we have a fossil fuel crisis because of the war in Iran, we have an affordability crisis, we need to go slow for a little bit while we figure things out, not do anything rash in the near term. What CARB did instead was lock in a system that is going to be nearly impossible to reform. that splits the coalition in support of the objectives that nominally CARB is supposed to share and makes it difficult to recover from the current period of difficult politics that you so rightly identified. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. And Shauna for the last word.
We do not need an abundance of pollution. This is the deregulatory agenda. This is the gaming of the system. And anyone who thinks otherwise hasn't opened the first page of any paper.
Thanks, Shauna. Thank you all to all of our panelists. Quickly want to know our call to action is to protect funding for climate solutions in the Cap and Invest program. The link was dropped in the chat. So feel free to use that link so you can connect with your legislator on the importance of maintaining climate integrity in the California Cap and Invest program. We also wanted to share that we will be hosting another webinar on September 17th. This one will focus on unlocking the potential of next generation geothermal energy in California, and we hope to see you there. Again, thank you to all the panelists and for everyone for joining this webinar. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.